Welcome back, everybody, to the fourth annual Cybersecurity Summit for Small Business. My name is Sean Murray. I'm a cyber consultant with the Pikes SBDC. We've been talking about lots of different things today. We've talked about governance. We've talked about risk. We've talked about cyber threats. We've talked about how it affects your organization and your small business. One of the things that we're going to talk about today that ties a lot of it together is what is the reason why we're doing some of this? Sure, we want to protect our business. We want to protect our reputation. We also want to protect our assets. And we want to comply with the law. At least in some instances, we must. It is a regulatory requirement in many industries. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about understanding the elements of compliance and compliance management, how it affects your business. Again, the Small Business Development Center, SBDC, here in Colorado Springs. Make sure that you take the information that you have, assess in your own mind, where do you think you're at? Make sure you contact us at the SBDC. Make some time with an SBDC consultant, myself, Rodney, Mark, one of the other talented cyber professionals, to help you better understand what's going on within your business. All right, so compliance management. All right, so again, we talk about risk. I talked about risk a little bit earlier. Everything that we do, from the time that we wake up in the morning to the time that we go to bed at night, there's an element of risk in everything that we do, from the way we manage our activities to the way that we run our business. We make decisions usually based on risk. And a lot of risk elements come from compliance requirements. And so we're going to talk about compliance management, compliance audits, and then compliance perspectives. Remember, we talk about perspectives as those feelings. How do I feel about risk? How do I feel about audits? How do I feel about complying with the law or other regulatory requirements? All right, so usually we start with risk constraints. Having an understanding of those things that I don't have or I can't do is going to be helpful in determining what I need to implement as far as controls. We talked about controls earlier when we were talking about risk treatment methods. All right, know your business, know your compliance requirements. All right, what industry do you work in? Are you in a highly regulated industry? Banking, finance, healthcare. A highly regulated industry is going to have a lot more requirements, not just from a cyber perspective, but from a reporting and a data protection perspective. And that usually aligns to the assets that process, transmit, and store information or data. And then there should be a requirement to identify your critical business processes that align with those assets that process the information that needs to be protected. So when we look at assets, right? Assets. All right, these are things that help your organization achieve whatever it is that you're in business to do. Contributing factors to calculating asset value. So assets have tangible value, the actual cost. How much did that asset cost? Well, it might have been $3,000 for that server, and then the applications, the software on the server. You have various endpoints, so computer systems, tablets, laptops. All right, these are all considered tangible assets. I can put my hands on them. I can see them. They have a monetary value. We also have what's called information assets. Sometimes the intangible value associated with the value of the information that's on the asset needs to be considered as well. So, contributing factors to calculating your asset value include financial penalties for legal non-compliance. So if I don't comply with the law and it's determined after a breach that I didn't do what I was supposed to do, I may have to pay for fines. So I have to consider that in my strategy and how I'm going to manage my assets. What is the impact on the business processes if those assets aren't available? Will my employees be able to do the level of work that they're required to? Damage to the reputation. There was a pretty good conversation around lunchtime today regarding damage to the reputation, either to you, your organization, or that perception that others may have about your organization because of a lack of a commitment to compliance standards that may have breached or unauthorized disclosed of information. So damage to your reputation should be something that you consider. That has value. or it should have value to you. And it should have value to your organization and the people that work for you as well. Additional costs for repair or replacement for your assets. Effect on third parties and business partners. Again, those relationships you have with other stakeholders, internal and external to your organization, may affect your reputation. You may be losing clients. You may be losing due to a hit on your reputation. Injury to staff and other personnel, violations of privacy. Most of our business processes, you've heard me say it before, are automated, so up to 80% of them. Most of our compliance requirements are driven based on the protection of privacy, sensitive information that I collect about my employees, my clients, consultants, if I'm in the healthcare industry, my patients. And there's a requirement, usually under some regulatory requirement, to be able to protect that privacy information or data. All right, violations of privacy, breach contracts. So what's required if you outsource some of your business activities to a third-party provider? What are the breach notification requirements if that independent third party breaches information on behalf of your organization, whether it was intentionally or unintentionally? You have to understand what the privacy laws and the compliance laws are in the state that you operate and within the country that you operate. We had a client here in the local business community that was struggling with the contract with a third service provider that does recording for their call center. And that call center may be recording sensitive information about a client that's calling in order to be able to process a financial transaction, which includes name, social security number, and other sensitive data. Because they can't disparage each recording individually from what state that they may reside in, you have to have an understanding of the breach notifications in each state. In this instance, the third-party cloud provider did not want to provide a 72-hour breach notification back to my client. But, so the client reaches out to me, hey, we're struggling in this area, what can you do to help? Well, I'm very familiar with the breach laws in each one of the states because we don't have an international or a national law in the United States that allows us to unilaterally across all 50 states protect privacy information. The state of Georgia specifically articulates in a law that if you're a third-party provider and you breach privacy data on behalf of your client, you have a 24-hour requirement to notify your client and start being part of the incident response process. So even while the company didn't want to comply with 72 hours, which was suggested in the contract, now that they know that the state of Georgia has the toughest compliance law, they have to comply with law. Therefore, now they have to comply with a 24-hour notification if they breach any privacy information on behalf of their client. So again, the level of expertise our cyber consultants have in these areas is going to help you protect your business because you want to comply with law. All right, loss of competitive advantage if you don't do this well. And of course, the legal costs associated with any reparations that a state or a federal entity may come back and want to claim on you. Other legal costs associated with civil actions that clients or customers may want to take against you. So some of the risk constraints that we talk about are financial in nature. So most oftentimes we are never going to protect an asset more than the value of the asset. There's two different exceptions to that rule. Approaches that cost more than the value of the target asset are discouraged unless the approach is a mandatory compliance requirement required by law or if it's written into a contract. Those are the only two exceptions as to when I would protect an asset more than the actual value of the asset. Compliance with industry norms is critical for some organizations like financial services, healthcare, and others, usually highly regulated organizations. So compliance management through audits. So this is how we determine whether or not you're compliant, right? Am I compliant with the law? Am I compliant with a regulatory compliant? Remember, not all regulations come from the federal government. We talked about payment card industry data security standard. It's not a law, but it's enforced and administered by the credit card industry. So if you don't comply with PCI DSS, the framework, the controls, and you don't pass the audits, they're going to remove your ability to process, transmit, and store credit card information or data. So audit management controls. Who's doing the audit? Is there integrity in the audit? Those things need to be demonstrated so that regulators know that you're actually in compliance. Analysis and interpretation of results. Depending on the organization performing the audit, the experience behind them, you need to be able to be assured that they have the experience necessary to identify what your security posture is and whether or not you're meeting your compliance requirements. And then addressing ineffective and missing controls. The whole intent of the audit or the assessment is to identify the gaps that we're not meeting and identify a risk treatment method, as we discussed during the risk management session, and then implement controls to reduce that risk and show a level of maturity in demonstrating compliance. An audit is an evaluation of a person, an organization, a system, process, enterprise, project, or a product. I think we know what an audit is. Audits can be scaled, very specifically looking at critical processes, or it can be scaled out to actually look at every single business process, take a look at physical assessments, take a look at social assessments. We do interviews and observations. We look at documentation, and we do technical assessments on our environment, our technical environment. And those also include things that are being provided by third-party providers as well. Think of the cloud, think of a managed service provider, anybody who's providing a capability for your organization. An information security audit, remember 80% of our business processes are automated, right? Is a systematic evaluation of the security of the organization's processes or systems by measuring how well they conform to a set of established criteria or controls. And some of these are geared towards a specific framework. An information security audit evaluates the effectiveness of the controls or measures the alignment to a framework, either internal compliance requirement or an external regulatory requirement. All right, so we use different terms, but they all pretty much mean the same thing. These are all synonyms for the evaluation of the effectiveness of security in an audit. So we're focusing on an information system security audit. So we use audit, we use the term assessment, testing, monitoring, review, evaluation. We do work with the FDIC. They use the word examination. So depending on what the compliance framework is, or the standard, or the control catalog, you're going to see these various terms. Risk-based audits. This is really what it's all about. Measuring your level of compliance to a standard to determine where the gaps are. Where are the risks based on what that gap is measuring? Audits should be designed to assess the controls that most significantly influence risk in your organization. It's important to evaluate the effectiveness after the controls have been implemented. So we do the assessment, we implement the controls, we got to go back and reassess. If we don't go back and reassess, it's not a checklist item. We got to assess and measure the effectiveness of the controls after they've been implementing. Is the organization achieving the desired level of risk mitigation and compliance? Do the controls support the risk treatment strategy? Remember, accept, retain, avoid, eliminate, share, transfer, mitigate, or modify. Do the controls support the risk treatment strategy selected by the organization? After we assess the effectiveness of those controls, we may determine that some or all of the strategy is not appropriate. We may need to go back and take a look at it again. Independence of the audit team. So an independent audit team eliminates concerns about conflict of interest. We go into organizations where they're talking about how great they did an assessment on their internal business processes, and we got an outstanding on our assessment. Well, you got to be a moron, I think, if you're doing an internal assessment and you're not doing well. Where the rubber really meets the road is to have that third-party assessment team come in, or a disinterested business process internally that is not associated with the IT department. So the IT department doing a self-assessment is not going to be as credible as the compliance team or the cybersecurity team going back, working with the compliance department doing the assessment, right? So an independent audit team eliminates concerns about conflict of interest. Evaluating standards and controls. So here we're talking about compliance through framework-based audits. So the guide associated with the control catalog will be used to evaluate the implementation and the effectiveness of the controls. Again, an auditor assessor needs to have some type of framework that articulates the intent of the controls, the measures or the sub-controls, the criteria associated with each control, as to determine whether or not it's been implemented effectively. So the frameworks that guide control selection also offer guidance for evaluating these controls. Some of these you saw earlier this morning in a different presentation. All right, ISO standards, ISO 27001. This is an international framework that many organizations in Europe and the Middle East and other parts of the world use to implement a sound cyber hygiene. So ISO 27001, the Information Security Management System. ISO 27002 is the controls digest associated with 27001. ISO 27004 is the audit/metrics guide that determines whether or not the controls in 27002 have been implemented properly for 27001. NIST. So if we go to the American side, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, we use NIST Special Pub 830, the risk assessment guide, to assess the controls from NIST Special Pub 853, and then we use 853A as the criteria to ensure that the control was implemented as intended. It basically takes 853 and turns it into a checklist. All right, the perceptions of those that are being audited against those who are performing the audits needs to be collaborated with. Other standards, so PCI DSS, all right, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. It is a framework with its own controls and its own audit methodology. Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. This was a law that was passed many years ago for the financial industry. It articulates how a financial or banking organization is required to protect your privacy information. You should be receiving once a year from your banks and your credit card companies what that notification is. So they have to notify you once a year, hey, this is how we use your data, can you control it? They have to provide that notification. There's also a framework for financial institutions in order to demonstrate how they're actually protecting your information. Hipaa. So again, 1996, this was a law passed to be able to protect healthcare information, what we call protected healthcare information. In 2004, it was updated to include the processing, transmitting, and storing of electronic personal health care information, EPHI. And so it's got its own framework. It's got its own requirements. International, PIPEDA is the privacy law for Canada, very comprehensive. GDPR is the European Union's approach to protecting privacy. It's interesting, you see the word international, CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. All right, while it was passed in California, it's an international law because it specifically states if you target a California citizen anywhere in the world, you have to comply with CCPA. So they put the amount of rigor into it that they can come after you for administrative or lawsuits for not complying with CCPA in the state of California. All right, laws, regulations, standards. All right, this is what we were talking about. It's the external influence based on the industry that we're in. All right, organizations are required to comply with the laws and the regulations of the jurisdictions in which they operate. If I'm a global organization, a global corporation, it gets pretty complex. This is where governance, risk compliance really comes in, having a GRC function to identify all of those laws, all of those rules I have to follow. And here on the Western side, we use common law, criminal law, civil law, but in other areas of the world, laws are based on cultures. They're based on religions in some instances. And so the complexity of compliance becomes much more significant. So it's important to know what the laws apply and understand the requirements of the laws. This can be challenging because many laws are open to interpretation, and required levels for compliance are not always stipulated. It's one of the most significant challenges for organizations. Laws are written at a high level, they're interpreted differently, and until you come in and do the assessment, I'm going to do whatever the minimum is until somebody tells me something that's different. Or there's a published standard or a framework that articulates what I should comply with. Many laws require adequate protection for sensitive data without specifying what an adequate level of protection should be. You may implement 256 AES encryption. All right, that means strong encryption to protect your data. Others may say, well, I'm going to take it, put it on a thumb drive, put the thumb drive in the safe. All right, it's left up to interpretation. What's the level of rigor that's involved, and what is the gap in between what's reasonable and what the expectations are? Laws and regulations often contradict one another, and then an organization that operates in various regions of the world may find it difficult to comply with all of the laws in each location. So you, in some instances, may have to hire local legal advice to ensure that you're meeting those requirements. Regulations often require organizations to report on whether or not they're compliant with regulations. They often refer to this as self-attestation. There are some frameworks that allow the government allows the organization to do and report self-attestation on a periodic basis. Failure to comply with regulations may result in financial penalties or loss of a license to operate, as well as damage to the reputation of the organization. In some instances, this may be unacceptable and create long-term disruption of your business. The organization should keep logs and records that can be used to validate whether information or information system has been assessed inappropriately, or improperly. And so this is a key thing to remember for all of you that are small businesses that have now purchased cyber insurance. Read the policy. Cyber insurance these days requires that you demonstrate a specific cyber hygiene, maybe demonstrating that you have a firewall and antivirus and other protection mechanisms within your business. And after a breach, if you make a claim, they're going to send in their own forensics team to ensure that after they do their investigation, you are meeting all those requirements, or they're not going to pay. All right, so an organization should keep those logs and records so that they can be used as evidence during the discovery period to demonstrate that specific hygiene. Reports on compliance should be accurate, complete, and submitted in a timely manner. To ensure compliance, an organization must have the ability to monitor and measure the controls that are in use. Reports should be comparable from one reporting period to another. And then any trends into an area for non-compliance should be identified and addressed. In cases where there's non-compliance, a justification for the reasons for non-compliance should be provided. It may be a strategy that I am not going to implement a specific control. That doesn't mean that I don't have an obligation to do something. Maybe I implement a compensating control. Maybe the risk is so great that I remove the risk altogether. The idea is that you acknowledge non-compliance, you've determined a different strategy, or you're accepting the risk, and it's part of the overall organizational strategy. If you're going to do it, justify it, write it down, and explain why. Corporate governance for compliance. So we've been talking about regulatory compliance, though. Those things external that we have to consider when we're looking at our compliance program. Well, part of the compliance program requires a look at my internal controls, which are, a lot of them are administrative in nature. Plans, policies, procedures that articulate not only that I have to do this, how I'm doing it, why I'm doing it, what's the strategic intent from the board of directors or the business owners, what are the obligations by tenants, employees, consultants, other stakeholders in my organization. A critical part of establishing your risk management process is the development and approval of your risk management policy. The policy reflects the attitude and intent of management in relation to risks, which also sets the tone for the risk culture in the organization. If it's not demonstrated at the top, then your employees are going to demonstrate the same level, the same attitude that organizational leaders have. Policy should include a statement relating to the reasoning or the rationale behind the approach to accepting or mitigating risk. Examples here may be mandating compliance with laws, regulations, setting the accountability for risk, measuring reporting on risk, and a commitment to continuous improvement in the risk environment. Awareness, education, and training. We're at the end of the presentation. This is a commitment of the organization, not just to say that we're going to do something, but communicate it to the additional stakeholders. All right, we do that through awareness and training. So awareness, education, and training can serve to mitigate some of the biggest organizational risk and achieve the most cost-effective improvement in risk and security. We've stated it several times today. The most significant risk to the organization is the human, whether it's intentional or whether it's malicious intent, or whether it's intentional, malicious, or whether it's accidental, carelessness. A sound training and education plan and program will help reduce the risk associated with the accidental or the unintentional insider threat. This can generally be achieved by educating the organization's staff, required procedures, policies, compliance, as well as ensuring that the staff can identify and understand the risk that threatens the organization. Remember, those policies that you're getting people to sign should have some level of rigor that holds them accountable in the event they don't comply with those policies. It's critical that the training effectively communicates the risk and its potential impact in order for the staff to understand the justification for what many see as inconvenient extra steps that risk mitigation and security controls often require. You have to let them understand why compliance is necessary, and it's not an option. I want to say thank you to all of our listeners, all of you that are watching the presentations throughout the day. This ties up the compliance aspect of governance, risk, compliance as it associates with businesses, small businesses, large businesses, to help you better understand how these pieces come together to help a small business owner understand what it has to comply with, how to choose a framework, and then implement controls to reduce risk. At the end of the day, you're trying to protect your business. Having a sound corporate governance, a risk management strategy that accommodates your compliance requirements is going to benefit you. Please contact the Pikes Peak Small Business Development Center. Make an appointment with a cyber consultant to help you with your business. Thank you very much.